A black woman, exhausted after weeks of grueling work, finally boards her first-class flight, looking forward to a quiet moment of peace. But when she politely asks for a glass of champagne, a flight attendant publicly humiliates her, questioning if she belongs in first class. Just 7 minutes after making one phone call, everything changes. Staff are held accountable. And what happens next leaves the entire cabin stunned. Stay with me, this is a story you may. Before we begin, comment below and tell us where you're watching from today. And if stories of resilience and justice inspire you, don't forget to hit subscribe for more impactful tales. The airport hummed with the subdued rhythm of ordinary life. The slow shuffle of travelers. The mechanical voice over the intercom. The faint aroma of brewed coffee mingling with the sterile scent of polished floors. All these were the sounds and smells of transit. Of people moving forward while rooted in place. Claire Williams sat in the corner of the lounge, her posture as precise as her neatly tailored navy suit. Her gold-rimmed glasses reflected the muted glow of the departure board, and her hands rested lightly on the handle of her leather carry-on. At a glance, Claire seemed like any other first-class traveler. But to the practiced eye, to those accustomed to reading between the lines of human interactions, she was a question mark. A black woman in first class, she was often a subject of silent calculations. Who is she? What does she do? Does she belong here? These questions, though unspoken, followed her like shadows, their presence so persistent she barely noticed anymore. When the boarding call finally came, Claire rose with the grace of someone long accustomed to performing for unseen audiences. She straightened her scarf, a soft, cream-colored blend of silk, and approached the gate. The attendant glanced at her ticket, offered a lukewarm smile, and waved her through. There was no warmth in the gesture, no acknowledgement of her humanity. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but Claire felt it like a pebble dropped into still water. The walk down the jet bridge was uneventful, but the moment she stepped into the first-class cabin, the air shifted. She saw it in the brief flicker of surprise on a fellow passenger's face, in the quick sideways glance of a flight attendant as Claire placed her bag in the overhead compartment. These were the subtle tremors that preceded the coming storm. She found her seat 2A, a window seat. The leather was cool against her back, the armrest solid beneath her fingers. Claire allowed herself a small smile. This was her sanctuary, her well-earned reprieve after weeks of long meetings, late nights, and negotiating deals that would never bear her name. She opened the menu tucked into the armrest, her eyes skimming over the options: roasted chicken, beef tenderloin, champagne. She let herself anticipate the crisp taste of bubbles, a rare indulgence. The flight attendants began their pre-flight routines, offering orange juice and water to passengers as they settled in. Claire noticed the way their smiles seemed brighter for some passengers and more perfunctory for others. It was an old script, one she knew by heart. When the tall, blonde attendant stopped at her row, Claire braced herself. "Good morning, ma'am," the attendant said, her tone polite but distant. "Can I get you something to start?" "Yes," Claire said evenly. "A glass of champagne, please." The attendant's smile froze, the corners of her mouth tightening. "Champagne is for first-class passengers," she said, her voice laced with an edge too sharp to miss. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Claire's heart skipped a beat, but her face betrayed nothing. She reached into her bag, retrieved her ticket, and handed it to the attendant with deliberate calm. "I'm quite certain," she said. The attendant scanned the ticket, her eyes narrowing slightly. After a moment, she handed it back with a strained smile. "My mistake," she said, though her tone made it clear she didn't believe it was a mistake at all. Without another word, she turned and walked away. The champagne did not arrive. Claire sat back, her fingers tightening around the armrest. Her stomach churned, not with anger, but with the familiar weight of disappointment. It wasn't the insult itself, she had faced far worse in her lifetime. It was the knowledge that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she achieved, she would always be a question mark to some. A black woman in first class. Across the aisle, a businessman with a Rolex and a neatly pressed suit chuckled softly. His smirk said everything his words did not. Claire met his gaze briefly, her expression unreadable, before turning to look out the window. The sun was rising, its golden light breaking through the clouds. It was beautiful, untouchable, and entirely indifferent to the struggles unfolding below. The moments passed slowly. each one thick with unspoken tension. When the attendant returned, she breezed past Claire's seat to serve champagne to the businessman. He winked at her as she poured, and they shared a quiet laugh. Claire heard the whisper of their conversation. Some people just don't know how to act in first class. The words were not meant for her ears, but they reached her all the same, lodging like splinters in her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. This was not new, this was not surprising, but it still hurt. Claire reached for her phone. Her fingers moved with practiced precision as she scrolled through her contacts and selected a name. The screen displayed 2 words, executive relations. She pressed call. Hello, she said, her voice calm and measured. This is Claire Williams. I'm on flight 315, and there's a situation I need resolved immediately. Her words cut through the quiet hum of the cabin, drawing the attention of passengers and crew alike. For the first time, the businessman across the aisle looked uneasy. The attendant faltered in her stride, her confidence slipping as she glanced toward the galley. The storm had arrived. The cabin settled into a semblance of quiet after Claire's phone call. But the air around her was thick with unspoken tension. She could feel it in the sideways glances from the other passengers, the abrupt hush in conversations whenever her name was mentioned in whispers. She sat still, composed, her phone resting on the tray table. This was not the first time she had been the center of such attention. But familiarity didn't dull the sting. The tall, blonde flight attendant, Lisa, reappeared at the far end of the aisle, speaking in hushed tones to another crew member. Their eyes darted toward Claire more than once, their expressions tight with unease. Lisa's earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a tautness in her shoulders, as though she were bracing for a blow. Claire watched them out of the corner of her eye, her face calm but her mind sharp, taking in every detail. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Lisa approached with a strained smile, holding a tray with 2 glasses of champagne. Her voice, now saccharine sweet, grated against the quiet of the cabin. Miss Williams, Lisa began, her tone straining under the weight of forced civility. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Please accept this with our compliments. Claire regarded the glasses, the delicate flute stems trembling slightly in Lisa's hand. There was no joy in the gesture, no genuine attempt to make amends. It was damage control, pure and simple. Claire let the silence stretch, the moment pressing down on the crew member like a weight. Then, with deliberate slowness, she folded her hands in her lap. No, thank you, she said softly but firmly, her gaze locking with Lisa's. I'd prefer not to have anything that isn't freely offered. Lisa's face tightened, and for a moment, the mask slipped. The barest flicker of frustration crossed her features before she quickly recovered. Nodding stiffly and retreating, her discomfort lingered in the air, palpable and raw. The flight ascended, piercing through clouds, as if trying to escape the weight of what had already unfolded. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, masking the quiet shifts and murmurs among the passengers. Across the aisle, the businessman with the Rolex leaned toward Claire, a thin veneer of politeness overlaying his curiosity. You've really got them on edge, he said, his voice low, as though confiding a secret. His smirk had returned, though now it seemed tinged with wariness. What do you do, anyway? Claire turned to him slowly, her expression measured. I work in conflict resolution, she replied, her tone neutral but pointed. It's a skill I've had to refine. The man blinked, clearly caught off guard. He chuckled nervously, raising his champagne glass in a mock toast before leaning back into his seat. Well, you're good at it, I'll give you that, he muttered. Claire turned back toward the window. Outside, the sky stretched vast and endless. Indifferent to the quiet turmoil below, she let her mind drift, recalling her mother's words from long ago. Sometimes, baby, the battle isn't what they throw at you. It's the space they leave for you to doubt yourself. Claire had carried those words through countless battles, through boardrooms, airports, and now this plane. She wouldn't doubt herself, not here. Not now. The first sign of escalation came not from the crew but from the passengers. A woman seated 2 rows back leaned toward her companion, her voice barely a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the cabin's quiet. Why does she need to make such a fuss? The woman murmured, her words carrying just far enough. I mean, it's just champagne. Claire didn't react, though her chest tightened. She'd heard versions of this before, dismissal cloaked in civility. As if to diminish the dignity of her stand, the woman's companion shushed her. But the damage was done. A ripple of unease spread through the cabin as others exchanged nervous glances. The next challenge came when Lisa reappeared, now accompanied by a man in a crisp navy suit, his badge gleaming under the cabin lights. Senior Operations Manager. It read. He walked with practiced authority, his steps measured, his face a mask of professional calm. Miss Williams, he began, his voice low but firm. I'm Daniel Carter, the Senior Operations Manager for this flight. I understand there's been an issue, and I'd like to personally apologize. Claire met his gaze, her expression unreadable. An apology is appreciated, Mr. Carter, she replied evenly, but apologies don't address the deeper issue. Do they? Carter hesitated, his practiced composure faltering for the briefest moment. He cleared his throat. I assure you, we're taking this matter seriously. The crew involved will be spoken to, and we're reviewing our protocols to ensure incidents like this don't happen again. Claire inclined her head slightly. And what happens after the speaking to? She asked, her voice calm but unyielding. How do you address the culture that allows this to happen in the first place? Carter's jaw tightened, but he nodded. We're committed to making changes, he said, though his words felt rehearsed. Claire allowed the conversation to end there, knowing the real test of commitment would come later. As Carter walked away, she caught sight of Lisa and another attendant whispering in the galley. Their glances toward her were fleeting but sharp, their unease bleeding into their movements. The plane steadied at cruising altitude, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained charged. Claire leaned back in her seat, her posture relaxed, though her mind stayed alert. She knew the weight of moments like this. They were never just about the champagne, never just about the immediate insult. They were about the unspoken rules, the invisible divides, and the quiet battles waged every day. In the rows behind her, the murmurs continued, soft but persistent. Claire let them wash over her, a reminder of the work still to be done. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead, but she also knew one truth: silence had never been her ally. For now, she waited. The real battle was just beginning. At 35,000 feet, the hum of the engine seemed louder than usual, drowning out the uneasy whispers of the first-class cabin. Claire Williams sat poised, her back straight against the leather seat, her hands lightly clasped on her lap. She exuded calm, but beneath the surface, her mind moved like a swift current, tracing every word, every glance, every unspoken assumption that had brought them all to this moment. The seatbelt sign had just clicked off when a new figure emerged, a passenger from economy class. He was young, white, and dressed in the casual uniform of entitlement, a hoodie and expensive sneakers. He stood in the aisle, surveying the rows, his gaze stopping on Claire with an audacity that made her breath hitch. For a moment, he hesitated, then stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the flight attendant. "I just wanted to ask, can I switch seats with her?" He gestured toward Claire. "I think she might be more comfortable in coach." The statement hung in the air, absurd yet painfully sharp. A murmur rippled through the cabin, some passengers shifting uncomfortably, others watching with veiled interest. Lisa, the flight attendant, froze. Her eyes darted between the young man and Claire, her face caught in a grimace of indecision. Claire didn't flinch. She turned her head slowly, meeting the man's gaze with an expression so composed it could have been carved from stone. "I'm perfectly comfortable where I am," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The young man hesitated, his smirk faltering. "I just thought He trailed off, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her steady gaze. Without another word, he turned and shuffled back toward economy, the quiet chuckles of other passengers following his retreat. Lisa looked at Claire briefly, her lips parting as though she might say something, but she thought better of it. Instead, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the galley. The interruption had punctured the fragile equilibrium of the cabin. The passengers, who had been silently digesting the earlier drama, now seemed torn between indignation and fascination. Claire felt their eyes on her, their judgments simmering beneath polite facades. Across the aisle, the businessman with the Rolex leaned forward again, this time with a thin veneer of sympathy. "That was uncalled for," he said, his voice carrying a rehearsed softness. "People just don't think sometimes." Claire turned to him, her expression inscrutable. They think plenty, she said quietly. They just don't always say it out loud. The man blinked, clearly unprepared for a response. He opened his mouth to speak again but closed it just as quickly, retreating into his seat with a faintly embarrassed shrug. The next challenge came from the galley. Mark, the other flight attendant, stepped into the cabin, his posture stiff and defensive. He carried a tray with fresh drinks, his movements mechanical as he began distributing them to passengers. When he reached Claire's row, he hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he placed a glass of sparkling water on her tray table. "Compliments of the airline," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said, her tone polite but distant. Mark lingered for a moment as if expecting something gratitude, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of his effort to smooth things over. When none came, he quickly moved on, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the cabin's collective scrutiny. The cabin descended into an uneasy quiet, but the atmosphere was electric. Claire could feel it. The way tension seeped into the air, thick and inescapable. It was in the way passengers avoided meeting her eyes, the way the crew moved with exaggerated politeness around her seat, their smiles stretched thin over their discomfort. She turned her gaze toward the window, the endless expanse of blue sky offering a brief respite. But even as she tried to lose herself in the view, her mind lingered on the moment in the aisle, the young man's audacity, the businessman's clumsy attempts at sympathy, the silent complicity of those around her. It was all part of the same pattern, a carefully constructed web of denial and deflection that shielded people from confronting the truths they didn't want to see. The crescendo came just as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. The seatbelt sign flashed on, and Lisa reappeared in the aisle, her voice tense as she instructed passengers to return to their seats. As she moved past Claire, her foot caught on the edge of the carpet, sending her tray of drinks crashing to the floor. The sound was startling, and for a moment, all eyes were on her. "Oh, for God's sake," Lisa muttered under her breath, her frustration spilling over. She bent to pick up the tray, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Claire watched silently as Lisa fumbled with the scattered glasses. When their eyes met, Lisa's face was flushed, her earlier confidence completely unraveled. "I'll clean this up," Lisa said quickly, her voice tight. "You don't need to intervene." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Claire didn't respond, she simply turned back to the window, letting the moment pass. But the weight of Lisa's words lingered, a reminder of the ways people tried to mask their discomfort with condescension. As the turbulence subsided, the cabin began to settle again, but the tension remained. Claire felt it in every glance, every whispered comment, every strained smile. She knew this wasn't just about a spilled tray or misplaced comment. It was about something deeper, something people didn't want to name. Racism didn't always announce itself with slurs or violence. Sometimes, it was quieter, more insidious, a look, a gesture, a question posed in the guise of concern. It thrived in the spaces where people told themselves it wasn't their problem, where they clung to the comfort of familiar lies. Claire closed her eyes, her breathing steady. She had fought these battles before, and she would fight them again. But for now, she let herself rest, knowing the fight was far from over. The plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, its engines humming steadily. But inside the first-class cabin, the tension simmered, invisible yet oppressive. Claire Williams remained seated by the window, her posture immaculate, her expression unreadable. Around her, the veneer of normalcy was beginning to crack, exposing the frailty of the social contracts that held these strangers together. Across the aisle, the businessman with the Rolex couldn't seem to keep his eyes off her. At first, he feigned nonchalance, tapping away at his tablet. But every so often, his gaze would drift in her direction, curiosity thinly veiled behind feigned interest in his surroundings. Claire felt his attention like a spotlight, intrusive and unwelcome. Finally, he broke the silence. "You know," he said, leaning slightly toward her, his voice pitched low as if sharing a secret. "I don't mean to pry, but it seems like you're making quite the statement today." Claire turned to him slowly, her gaze steady. "A statement?" she repeated, her tone calm but edged with steel. He gestured vaguely, as though the answer were self-evident. "Well, with everything that's happened, you've got the whole cabin on edge." Claire's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. one that didn't reach her eyes. If holding people accountable makes you uncomfortable, she said evenly, perhaps it's worth examining why. The man flushed slightly, retreating into his seat with a muttered, just trying to make conversation. He didn't speak to her again. The first-class cabin had begun to split into factions. Some passengers exchanged glances, their whispers laced with barely concealed disdain. Others avoided looking in Claire's direction altogether, their discomfort manifesting as polite indifference. The flight crew, meanwhile, moved with a strained efficiency, their smiles tighter, their movements more deliberate. Claire noted all of it, each subtle shift in behavior. She had spent a lifetime navigating these waters, reading the unspoken language of prejudice that often disguised itself as civility. The tension wasn't new, but its intensity had grown, fueled by the passengers' collective discomfort with what Claire represented a disruption to their carefully curated world. The next challenge came in the form of a middle-aged woman seated 2 rows back. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her jewelry understated but expensive. She leaned forward, addressing the passenger next to her in a voice that was just loud enough for Claire to hear. "Do you think she planned this?" the woman whispered, her tone dripping with suspicion. "Some people love to stir the pot. You know." Her companion, a man in his 60s with a salt and pepper beard, shifted uncomfortably. "I don't think that's fair," he said, his voice cautious. "It sounds like she's had a legitimate complaint." The woman scoffed. "Legitimate? Please. These days, everyone's looking for something to be offended about." Claire didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The words were as clear as a slap. A reminder of how easily people dismissed her experiences, reframing them as overreactions or manipulations. As the plane reached its cruising midpoint, the turbulence wasn't confined to the air. Lisa, the blonde flight attendant, reappeared, her expression a careful mask of professionalism. She carried a tray of hors d'oeuvres, her steps measured as she stopped beside Claire's seat. "Miss Williams," Lisa said, her voice clipped but polite. "Would you care for an appetizer? We have smoked salmon, truffle crostini, or caviar." Claire looked up at her, noting the tension in the set of her jaw, the way her hands gripped the tray just a little too tightly. "No, thank you," Claire replied, her tone polite but firm. Lisa hesitated, as though expecting a different response. Then, with a terse nod, she moved on, her shoulders stiff as she retreated to the galley. The businessman across the aisle, emboldened by the exchange, leaned forward again. "You really know how to hold your ground," he said, his tone attempting camaraderie. "I mean, I couldn't do it standing up to them like that." Claire turned to him, her gaze piercing. "It's not about courage," she said quietly. "It's about necessity. I shouldn't have to stand up to anyone for what's rightfully mine." Her words hung in the air, silencing him once more. The final challenge of the chapter came unexpectedly, as the cabin lights dimmed for the evening portion of the flight. A young, nervous-looking flight attendant approached Claire. She was different from Lisa and Mark. Her movements were tentative, her wide eyes betraying her inexperience. "Miss Williams," the attendant began softly, her voice trembling. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how you've been treated. It wasn't right." The apology was unexpected, its sincerity disarming. Claire regarded the young woman for a moment, noting the way she wrung her hands, the faint flush in her cheeks. "You're not the one who needs to apologize," Claire said gently but firmly. "But thank you." The young attendant nodded quickly, her relief evident. As she turned to leave, Claire stopped her with a question. "What's your name?" "Emily," the attendant replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily," Claire repeated, her tone softening. "Next time, don't wait to speak up. Silence helps no one." Emily nodded again, her expression a mix of gratitude and determination. As she walked away, Claire allowed herself a small, private smile. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of complicity that held up so much of the world's prejudice. The cabin returned to its uneasy quiet, but the atmosphere had shifted slightly. Claire gazed out the window at the vast expanse of sky, her reflection faint against the glass. She thought of her mother, her grandmother, the generations of women who had fought battles like this in different forms, in different times. Each challenge, each confrontation, was a reminder that the fight was far from over. But it was also a reminder of something more profound, that every moment of resistance, no matter how small, carried the potential to reshape the world. And Claire was nothing if not a believer in change. The silence in the cabin was not the kind of silence that soothed. It was brittle, like glass under pressure, threatening to shatter with the slightest wrong move. Claire Williams remained at the center of it, her calm demeanor masking the simmering tension she felt in every glance. Every whisper, every act of overcompensation that radiated from the crew and passengers around her. The businessman across the aisle, seemingly unable to leave well enough alone, leaned toward her once again. His tone was conversational, but there was something in his words that betrayed a deeper discomfort. "You know," he began, his voice pitched low as though sharing a confidence. "I've seen this kind of thing before. My sister's married to a guy who's, well, like you." He gestured vaguely, as if the words he couldn't bring himself to say would be somehow softened by his tone. "And he's always talking about how hard it is, how people don't treat him right. But I just don't get it. I mean, we're all the same at the end of the day, right?" Claire turned to him, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "If we're all the same," she said evenly, "then why do some of us have to explain ourselves more than others?" The man's smile faltered, and for a moment, he looked as though he might argue. But then he shrugged, retreating into the safety of his silence. It was a familiar pattern his curiosity satisfied just enough to soothe his guilt, but not enough to challenge his assumptions. The next challenge came from the crew, who had grown increasingly flustered as the flight continued. Mark, the flight attendant who had been hovering at the edges of the cabin all evening, approached Claire's seat with a strained smile. He held a clipboard, his pen poised as though ready to take down her every word. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I've been asked to ensure that everything is to your satisfaction. Is there anything else we can do to make your flight more comfortable?" Claire regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "What I'd like," she said slowly, "is an explanation for why I've been treated differently from the moment I boarded this plane." Mark's smile wavered. I'm not sure what you mean," he said, though the redness creeping up his neck told a different story. "I think you do," Claire replied, her voice calm but unyielding. "But since you're unsure, let me be clear. From the moment I asked for champagne, I've been treated as though I don't belong here. And I'm asking you, as a representative of this airline, to explain why." Mark's discomfort was palpable. He glanced around the cabin, as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. "I can assure you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "that was never our intention." Claire leaned back in her seat, her gaze never leaving his. "Intentions don't matter as much as actions," she said. "You should think about that." Mark nodded stiffly and retreated to the galley, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. The cabin had grown quieter, the tension now so thick it felt like a physical presence. Passengers shifted in their seats, their discomfort radiating outward like ripples in a pond. Claire felt their unease, their need to make sense of the situation without confronting its deeper implications. It was in this uneasy quiet that the woman from 2 rows back made her move. She rose from her seat, her movements precise, her expression a mask of polite indignation. Approaching Claire, she spoke with a tone that was meant to sound conciliatory but carried an unmistakable edge. "I just wanted to say," the woman began, "that I think you've handled all this with a great deal of poise. But, if I may, don't you think it's time to let it go? I mean, these things happen, and dwelling on them doesn't really help anyone." Claire looked up at her, her expression calm but her gaze piercing. "And what exactly am I supposed to let go?" she asked. The woman faltered, her carefully rehearsed speech unraveling. "Well," she said, "you know, the misunderstanding. The tension." Claire nodded slowly. "The tension," she repeated. "You mean the discomfort you're feeling because someone like me dared to hold people accountable?" The woman flushed, her composure slipping. "That's not what I meant," she stammered. "I just think it's important to move forward." Claire's voice remained steady, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "Moving forward requires acknowledging where we've been. Pretending this is just a misunderstanding doesn't change the fact that it isn't." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. After a moment, she turned and walked back to her seat, her posture rigid with embarrassment. As the flight continued, the cracks in the cabin's fragile facade became more pronounced. The crew moved with exaggerated care, their every action laced with overcompensation. The passengers whispered more openly now. their voices a mix of discomfort, indignation, and reluctant respect. Claire remained steady, her composure a quiet defiance against the weight of their judgments. She knew that her presence here, her refusal to accept less than what she deserved, was a disruption to the status quo, a reminder that the rules of this world were not as fair or as equal as people liked to believe. Toward the end of the chapter, the captain himself emerged from the cockpit. His uniform was immaculate, his demeanor carefully neutral as he approached Claire's seat. "Miss Williams," he began, his voice low and professional, "I wanted to personally apologize for any issues you've experienced on this flight. I assure you, we take these matters very seriously." Claire regarded him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she said finally. "But words only mean so much. What are you doing to make sure this doesn't happen again?" The captain hesitated, his practiced confidence faltering. "We're reviewing our protocols," he said, "and I'll make sure this incident is reported to the proper channels." Claire nodded. "I hope so," she said, "because if it isn't, you'll be hearing from me again." The captain inclined his head, his respect for her evident. "Understood, ma'am." As he walked away, the cabin seemed to exhale, the tension easing slightly. But Claire knew the work was far from over. The fight against prejudice was never a single battle, it was a war fought in small, quiet moments, in conversations that exposed the truth and challenged the lies people told themselves to avoid facing it. And Claire, as always, was ready for the fight. The cabin had grown still, the kind of stillness that followed an unspoken agreement to avoid further confrontation. But silence, Claire Williams knew, was rarely an indicator of peace. It was more often a pause, a holding of breath before the next storm. The first-class section, filled with its understated luxury, had become a crucible of quiet tension. Passengers shuffled in their seats, some pretending to read, others staring intently at the screens in front of them. Yet, Claire could feel the weight of their collective attention pressing against her back. They weren't done. The battle, waged in glances and whispers, was far from over. The murmurs began anew. A couple seated diagonally across from Claire leaned toward each other, their voices pitched low but not low enough. "I just don't understand," the man muttered, his words carrying a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Why does it have to be about race every time? Maybe it was just bad service." The woman, her pearls glinting under the cabin lights, nodded emphatically. "Exactly," she agreed. "These days, everyone's looking for something to be offended by. It's exhausting." Claire didn't turn to face them, though her chest tightened with every word. She had heard variations of this argument all her life, a refrain designed to shift the blame back onto her shoulders. If she didn't speak up, she was complicit. If she did, she was accused of overreacting, of making it about race. It was never about race until it was. The next confrontation was quieter but sharper. Lisa, the blonde flight attendant, reappeared with a fresh tray of drinks, her steps careful and deliberate. She stopped at Claire's row, her face frozen in a mask of professionalism. "Miss Williams," she said, her voice tight, "I brought you a selection of beverages. On behalf of the airline, I'd like to apologize again for earlier." Claire looked up, her expression neutral. "You've apologized several times," she said evenly, "but the behavior hasn't changed." Lisa flinched, just slightly, before recovering her composure. "I'm doing my best to make this right," she replied, though her tone lacked conviction. "Are you?" Claire asked, her voice soft but firm. "Or are you doing your best to manage the optics?" Lisa's face reddened, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might argue. But instead, she placed the tray on Claire's table with a curt nod before retreating to the galley. The tension that followed her lingered, a testament to the unspoken truth Claire had forced her to confront. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight entered its final hours, but the darkness did little to obscure the growing unease. The businessman across the aisle, who had fallen silent earlier, leaned toward Claire once more. This time, his voice carried an edge of defensiveness. "You know," he began, "some of us here just want to enjoy our flight without all this drama." Claire turned to him slowly, her gaze sharp. "Drama," she repeated. "Is that what you think this is?" The man hesitated, his confidence faltering. "I mean, look," he said, gesturing vaguely. "It's not like anyone's out to get you. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe you're reading too much into it." Claire's chest tightened, but her voice remained calm. "Tell me," she said, How many times have you been asked if you belong in a seat you paid for? How often do you have to explain yourself just to be treated with the same respect as everyone else? The man opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, his face reddening. He looked away, muttering something under his breath. The final challenge of the chapter came from an unexpected source. As the plane began its descent, the senior operations manager, Daniel Carter, returned to the cabin. His demeanor was composed, but the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes betrayed the toll of the day's events. "Miss Williams," he said, stopping at her seat, "I wanted to provide you with an update. The airline has begun an immediate review of this incident, and disciplinary action is being considered for the crew members involved." Claire regarded him silently for a moment. "Disciplinary action," she repeated. "And what about the passengers who sat here, watched it happen, and said nothing? What about the culture that allows it to happen in the first place?" Carter shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the question. "We're addressing the systemic issues as well," he said finally, though his tone was hesitant. Claire nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "I'll be watching," she said simply. "I hope your actions match your words." Carter inclined his head and retreated to the galley, leaving behind a cabin heavy with unresolved tension. As the plane descended, the sprawling lights of the city below came into view, a glittering reminder of the world waiting beyond the confines of the cabin. Claire leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Racism was never loudest in the moments people recognized. It lived in the silences, in the deflections, in the carefully crafted arguments designed to absolve guilt. It thrived in the spaces where people convinced themselves they were blameless, where discomfort was dismissed as unwarranted drama. But discomfort, Claire knew, was necessary. It was the crack in the foundation, the first step toward dismantling something far more insidious. And as the plane touched down, Claire resolved to keep pushing, to keep speaking, no matter how heavy the weight of perception became. For her, the fight wasn't about winning, it was about refusing to lose. As the plane approached its final hour of flight, the cabin seemed to settle into an uneasy rhythm. But Claire Williams, seated calmly by the window, knew better than to trust the surface. Tensions like this never disappeared, they shifted. They reformed, but they rarely dissolved. Racism, in her experience, was much the same. It adapted to survive. Across the aisle, the businessman who had repeatedly tried to engage her now sat stiffly, his discomfort palpable. The couple 2 rows back exchanged whispers, their glances still flitting toward her as though her presence alone was a puzzle they could not solve. And the flight attendants, well, they had perfected the art of avoidance, though their nervous energy betrayed them. It began with a seemingly benign request. A woman in her 70s, her white hair pinned back in a tight bun, pressed the call button for a flight attendant. When Lisa appeared, the woman leaned in, her voice pitched just low enough that only nearby passengers could hear. "Excuse me," she began, her tone polite but firm. "Is it possible to move to another seat? I just feel more comfortable." Lisa blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I'm sorry, ma'am, may I ask why?" The woman hesitated, then glanced toward Claire, her eyes darting away as quickly as they landed. "It's just, all this fuss. I came here to relax." Lisa glanced toward Claire as well, her expression tightening. "I'm afraid the cabin is full," she replied stiffly, "but if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." The woman sighed, waving her hand dismissively. "Never mind," she muttered, but the damage was done. Her words hung in the air, a subtle but unmistakable reinforcement of the idea that Claire's very presence was an inconvenience. Moments later, Mark, the second flight attendant, approached Claire with another attempt at reconciliation. He carried a tray with a single champagne flute, its contents bubbling under the cabin lights. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice strained but composed, "on behalf of the crew, I'd like to offer you this as an apology for any earlier misunderstanding." Claire looked at the glass, then at Mark. "An apology?" she said, her voice calm but pointed. "Or a symbol to show the rest of the cabin that you've resolved the situation?" Mark's face flushed, his grip on the tray tightening. I just want to make things right." "Making things right," Claire replied, her tone steady, "requires more than a gesture. It requires accountability." The silence between them stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Mark eventually placed the glass on her tray table and walked away. His shoulders hunched under the weight of the interaction. The murmurs began again, louder this time, as though the passengers sensed that the tension had reached a tipping point. The couple behind Claire grew bolder, their conversation carrying clearly in the quiet cabin. "Why does everything have to be a fight?" the man muttered, his voice tinged with exasperation. "Some people just love to play the victim." Claire's fingers tightened briefly on the armrest, but she did not turn around. Instead, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had learned long ago that there was no point in engaging those who refused to see beyond their own comfort. The final confrontation came as the plane began its descent. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the destination. Passengers began gathering their belongings, the quiet rustling of bags and coats filling the air. But for Claire, the battle was far from over. The woman with the white hair stood once more, this time addressing Claire directly. "I don't mean to be rude," she began, her voice tight, "but don't you think you've made enough of a scene? Some of us just want to enjoy the flight." Claire turned to her, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "A scene?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Is that what you think this is?" The woman hesitated, but then she pressed on. "I just think you're making it harder for everyone. It's not always about race. You know." Claire studied her for a long moment, the weight of decades of similar encounters settling on her shoulders. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate. "You're right," she said. "It's not always about race. But when it is, pretending it isn't doesn't make it go away. It just lets it grow in silence." The woman flushed, her bravado faltering. She opened her mouth to respond, but Claire had already turned away, her focus shifting back to the window. As the plane touched down, the cabin fell into an uneasy quiet. Passengers began filing out, their movements subdued, their expressions unreadable. Claire waited until the aisle was clear, then stood, gathering her belongings with deliberate care. When she stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air was a relief, a balm against the tension she had endured. But as she walked through the terminal, her thoughts lingered on the faces of the passengers, the quiet complicity of the crew, the unwillingness of so many to confront what lay beneath the surface. Racism, Claire knew, didn't always come in the form of slurs or overt acts of discrimination. More often, it hid in the cracks, in the silences, in the moments when people chose comfort over truth. And it thrived there, fed by the fragile masks people wore to convince themselves they were better than the system they upheld. Claire adjusted her scarf and continued forward. The fight wasn't over, it never was. But she had planted a seed of discomfort. And sometimes, that was enough. For now, the terminal buzzed with the quiet chaos of a flight's arrival, suitcases rolling across tile floors, announcements echoing overhead, and weary travelers making their way toward connections or freedom. Claire Williams stepped into this tide, her steps deliberate, her shoulders squared. She was used to moving through spaces like these, spaces that asked her to shrink, to be small, to not disturb the delicate balance of other people's comfort. But today, she wasn't shrinking. Today, she carried the weight of the flight like a badge. It sat on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder, a call to do what others often wouldn't. The first challenge came as she reached the baggage claim area. The older woman from the flight, her white hair still perfectly pinned, approached her. For a moment, Claire thought she might offer another sharp comment or demand a final word of superiority. But when the woman spoke, her voice was softer, almost tentative. "I wanted to say," she began, then paused, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. "I suppose I didn't consider how you must feel. It's not easy, is it? Always having to prove yourself." Claire looked at her, surprised by the shift in tone. "No," she said simply. "It's not." The woman nodded slowly, as though processing the weight of her own realization. "Well," she said after a moment, "I hope you keep doing it. I don't know if I could." Claire gave her a small, measured nod. "Thank you," she replied, "but it shouldn't have to be done alone." The woman hesitated, then walked away, her steps slower, her posture less rigid. Claire watched her go, wondering if the discomfort the woman had felt on the plane had finally cracked something open. It wasn't a victory, but it was a ripple. And sometimes, that was all you could ask for. As Claire waited for her suitcase, a younger black woman approached her. She was dressed in casual travel clothes, her hair pulled into a neat bun, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice warm but tinged with hesitation. "I just wanted to say I saw what happened on the flight. And the way you handled it, it was inspiring." Claire raised an eyebrow, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, "but it shouldn't have had to happen at all." The woman nodded. "I know," she said, "but seeing someone stand up like that, it matters. It reminded me that we don't always have to accept what we're given." Claire smiled faintly. "We don't," she said, "but it's a long fight." "It is," the woman agreed, "but at least we're not in it alone." The two exchanged a brief but meaningful look before the younger woman walked away. Her presence a quiet affirmation that the ripples Claire had created were already spreading. The final challenge came not from a stranger but from within. As Claire walked toward the airport exit, her phone buzzed with an email notification. She stopped, standing to the side of the flow of travelers, and opened it. It was from the senior operations manager, Daniel Carter. The email was brief but pointed. Subject: follow-up on flight incident. "Miss Williams, thank you for your patience and for bringing this matter to our attention. I wanted to inform you that we've initiated a comprehensive review of our onboard practices and training protocols. The crew members involved are under suspension pending further investigation, and we are implementing immediate steps to address systemic issues within our service approach. Additionally, we would like to invite you to participate in an advisory role as we work toward these changes. Your voice would be invaluable in shaping a more equitable future for all our passengers. Sincerely, Daniel Carter, Senior Operations Manager, Global Air." Claire read the email twice. Her emotions a complicated mix of satisfaction and skepticism. She knew how easily words could fade once the moment passed. Promises made in the heat of a situation often dissolved in the cold light of ordinary days. But then she thought of the younger woman who had approached her. Of the white-haired woman's hesitant acknowledgement, of every glance, every whisper, every ripple that had begun on that flight. Change was slow, often agonizingly so, but it didn't start with policy. It started with people. As she stepped outside, the crisp air hit her face, a stark contrast to the enclosed tension of the plane. Claire stood still for a moment, letting the coolness ground her. The world outside the airport was vast and indifferent, but it was also full of potential. Every step forward, every moment of resistance, no matter how small, added to a larger story. She thought of her grandmother, who had once told her, "Dignity isn't something they give you. It's something you carry, even when they try to take it away." Claire adjusted her scarf, took a deep breath, and stepped into the world. The fight was far from over. But today, she had made ripples, and in time, she knew, those ripples would grow into waves.